Okay. Hey, folks. Welcome to the Battles of the First World War podcast. With me today is Dr. Michael LoCicero, here to discuss his frankly magnificent book, A Moonlight Massacre, the night operation on the Passchendaele Ridge, 2nd December 1917. We'll talk more about the book in a few moments. I'd like to begin with an introduction of Dr. LoCicero himself. So, Dr. LoCicero, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. Just call me Mike, please.
You got it. Thank you. Mike, so first question is just to get to know you and so our audience can get to know you is, so, and I find this whole story fascinating here, but you are an American expat living in the UK, writing about a little known action at the end of the Anglo-German Third Battle of Ypres in World War I. What has been the journey that has brought you down this road to writing this book?
Well, I'd always been interested in the First World War as a child, and then when I went to university as an undergrad, it was rekindled by a lecture that I had, and really became something of an obsession, and to the point where I would, whenever chance I could get, take a trip to Western Europe and obviously go to to the Somme and the Ypres sectors. I was primarily interested in the British and the British Empire, Britain and the British Empire's involvement in the First World War. And with this particular operation in December 1917, which is a forgotten tailpiece of the Third Battle of Ypres, I was in a secondhand bookshop in Ypres one summer day and just doing a shelf browse. And I saw a dog-eared copy of a book on the British 8th Division. It was published in 1926. The authors are Borston and Bax. And I pulled it off the shelf and opened it up randomly, and there was a map. And it said Passchendaele, 1st and 2nd December 1917. And knowing that the campaign, at least the last attack of the campaign, was 10th of November 1917, I was puzzled. I said, well, what's this? And so the next day, I went out to the area of, at least generally, where I knew the attack was launched. Mm-hmm. It's a place, it was an intersection called Vindictive Crossroads. It's now Vindictive Traffic Circle or Roundabout, as they would call them in Britain. And I remember looking east and thinking, oh, I know something out there happened, but, I didn't have the map with me. I didn't have a copy of it, but, and it remained in the back of my mind. And when I decided to pursue a master's and also subsequent to that, a PhD, this seemed to be an area of First World War military history that was in need of a study. And so I took it upon myself to do so.
Awesome. Super cool. All right. And so, and now, what started your interest in the Great War in general? Like, I know it started at a pretty young age, correct?
Yeah, actually, I can answer that question for you rather easily. I was, at the time, I was a child. We were living in this small town in Pennsylvania called Academy.
Okay.
And the school that I went to, which is now the town hall, there was a bronze statue in front of it of a doughboy. And it was one of those mass-produced statues at a lot of communities on both sides of the pond and in France, but that they purchased to commemorate their veterans and their war dead. And it was this doughboy holding the Springfield rifle and holding a victory laurel aloft. That you've probably seen it in the Brody helmet and whatever. And I remember I was 7 or 8 and just gazing at this. I was fascinated by it. And I'd say that was probably where I actually became aware of the Great War. And, if you've ever seen it, you might be too young for this, but there was a popular book with children, a series called the How and Why books. And they had the How and Why book of World War I. And that was another book that, at the time. And then, I got interested in other things, history related. But then, as I mentioned earlier, returning to university, I became seriously interested in the war again. And I became a bit of an Anglophile after reading Martin Middlebrook's classic The First Day on the Somme, which
Hmm.
was published, I believe, in 1971.
Wow, fascinating. That's so cool. That's so cool. Okay, so let's talk about the book. So I'm going to discuss the book here. So I'm just going to hold it up. So the book is, again, it's a Moonlight Massacre, and I've just, so first of all, it's an excellent book. Like, just both for the content, which we'll get to, but even just for the physical aspects. Like, folks, for you folks watching the Zoom talk, so the book is it's about an inch thick, but it is physically heavy, and I think that speaks to like the amount of information in here. This book has been very deeply researched. Mike here has definitely done all of the homework in accomplishing and writing this book, which you told me before the call started here was about an 11-year process for you, correct?
It was 11 years from the commencement of the research to the publication. And in that time, I earned the master's in the US and then the PhD at the University of Birmingham.
That's
And it was, it was certainly like the learning curve for me. I mean, with all the revisions and whatever else, I think it's something I can produce much quicker now. But back then, all kinds of, discovering archival material or publications, especially when I came to Britain, that I wouldn't have had access to in the
right.
United States. And as early as 2003, I took a research trip. It was the first time to go to Ypres and walk the ground, and and then I went back any number of times. So it was it was something that I immersed myself in, if you will.
Oh, that's amazing. So the book covers, for listeners out there, you get every level. You get the Tommy on the ground, even the German. I think of them as the term they use, the Frontkämpfer. You get their point of view. You get the colonels. You get the general's view. You get the corps and army level view as well. So every level is in this book. It's again deeply researched. There are maps that you can frequently refer to that make sense. So the maps are amazing. There's even color plates on what a Tommy and a German soldier would have looked like in late 1917. So it's fantastic. And another point with the photographs in the book is when you mention someone, a particular officer comes up in the text, his photograph, if there is a photograph of him, it's going to be right around probably the very page that he's being mentioned on. So that's been fantastic. And I have to say, this book also increased my vocabulary by 4 words, and so which I wield, coppice, boskage, and Argus, which I had never heard those words before. So, and going into Argus just a little deeper, it's also deepened my knowledge of Greek mythology, because I now know what an Argus was. So, so like, it's just, I can't say enough about how
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Was.
Thank you very much.
So to talk about the book, so I think you've alluded to it already a little bit with finding that book in the Ypres bookshop, but so like getting into Moonlight Massacre, like, is there anything else you can share with us about like how, like, what inspired you to go deep into this particular operation?
In respect to something you said earlier, you mentioned about the maps, and that's an interesting story. One of the top military cartographers in the United Kingdom is Barbara Taylor. Her name's Barbara Taylor, and she does a number of books for us. Okay. She was the cartographer, and the problem that I had when I did my thesis, for instance, was the maps that were available. And I mentioned that one that was in the 8th Division history, but any of the maps I had came from the official documents, in the National Archives, the TNA, the War Office series. And the problem is that this particular attack was launched on the boundary of 2 corps, right, and on the boundary of 2 divisions of those separate corps. And so if you looked at the map for the division on the right, it would only cover that particular area, whereas and the same with the division on the left, and they had to be brought together. So so having Barbara compile, those maps. I mean, it even took. I live in the Midlands in Britain, and I took a trip down south to Reading, okay, which is past London, and we had to like meet face to face and go over some things. But I think she did a fantastic job. And as far as I know, for this particular operation, it's the first time that the details of the maps that were available have been brought together, in a series of maps. And certainly, thank you for your comments about the maps, but it certainly was by design, because if you're going to write about something like this, as complex as it is, you need to have good maps. I'm sure any of your listeners have experiences where you have a book that you're reading, and the maps are either non-existent or not up to standard, and it's frustrating because you're trying to understand what happened on the ground, and you can't, because the maps are really not much use.
Right.
So we wanted to have really, and I remember my publisher, when he approached me about publishing with him, he said to me, what made me decide, he said, your book is going to in need of good maps, and we will, they finance the maps. I know I have colleagues who have been told basically, well, you want maps, carry on with that, but the publisher is not going to be involved. And so I had some real support at the production end of the volume, and I got the book. Essentially, I got the book that I wanted.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's great. That's awesome. That's awesome. All right. So we're getting into this operation. So this was an operation that took place in early December of 1917. So longtime listeners of the podcast are probably already World War I enthusiasts, but if you can, Mike, put us in that Ypres salient, maybe even more specifically in the Passchendaele salient in November 1917. So what was the purpose of the 2nd of December attack, and what were its objectives?
Well, the 2nd December attack is a result of the final phase of Third Ypres and things that need to be done operationally to improve the position had been captured. And although Third Ypres is often portrayed as a disaster for the British, it's often forgotten that the German army was there. The German army received a real hammering at Third Ypres.
They did.
And also, one of the offensive was very broad in scope when it opened on the 31st of July. You had the previous offensive at Messines, when they captured the lower portion of the ridge, or most of it. And now the northern operation was to capture the central part of the ridge and the northern part. Why is the Passchendaele Ridge important? Because once you capture that high ground, you dominate the Bruges Basin.
Yep.
Downhill into low ground. Okay, the German army has to defend it because of these key railway hubs, Rousselard and Terreau. And Rousselard, for instance, going a little ahead of myself, but in the Moonlight Massacre, if you go to the battlefield today, the Southern Redoubt, you can see into the environs of Rousselard and all the building villages and whatever in between that. So the offensive, the strategic scope of it was to clear the Germans out of Belgium. And it was understood. This happened in 1918. When Rousselard and Terreau fell, the Germans had to abandon Belgium. So, it makes strategic sense. It's whether or not, the British and the French, the French had an army attacking to the left of the British, had the capability of doing so. And they were also quite unlucky. And, in just covering this now is to understand that what happened in when the offensive opened on the 31st of July, was it Napoleon that said that one of the key things that a general had to have was luck. And Haig and the British Army were not lucky in 1917. They had aberrational rainfall.
Right.
Throughout August and into early September that didn't clear up until mid-September. And so the offensive itself, you're attacking in this low-lying ground that's intersected by streams that drain the higher ground. Okay, it's essentially you capture a ridge, you advance into a valley where there'll be They were called beaks. They were usually like these man-made streams. They're not very big if you go there. You can usually jump over them.
Really?
But you have a clay sub base. You have these tremendous artillery barrages firing millions of shells to get through the German defenses. And with this heavy rainfall, it becomes in places a literal swamp. And it was an aberrational rainfall. Haig's chief of intelligence up until early 1918, Brigadier General Charters, interestingly enough, says in his memoirs that it rained in Flanders like this steadily, like a monsoon, I think is how he described it, every year. That's nonsense. Wow. You just have to look at the rainfall for 1914, 15, 16. Nothing like that. They were just very, very unlucky. And the offensive stalled. Okay, and it wasn't until they I'll talk about this, I'm sure, later on, but it wasn't until the offensive stalled and there was a change in command of focus of the army that was the spearhead of the offensive that things changed. Of course, the weather also cleared up too. But ultimately, let's say that the British would have captured those rail hubs. There was going to be a landing on the Flanders coast farther to the west.
Correct.
And and the hope was to drive the Germans out of Belgium. And one other thing to keep in mind is that as the campaign progressed, in the second phase, the successful phase, between the 20th of September and the 4th of October, the Germans are on the ropes. They're desperate. They're actually considering withdrawing from the ridge into that low ground just to get away from the British guns.
Wow.
And so, it's not just this, futile is a word that I hate when we talk about the Great War. I think it does a disservice to the men that fought. They didn't think it was futile. Okay, I mean, certainly, I guess my point is not everybody was a sensitive war poet in the First World War. Okay,
right,
and it's not to make light of the human suffering and the cost. I'm not saying that, but to just dismiss it as a waste. It contributed to the defeat of Germany. There's no question about it. I mean, if you're looking at it from an Allied perspective, from a British perspective, it contributed to their defeat. Certainly, Ludendorff and Hindenburg after the Somme, after the offensives in 1917, Arras and Chemin des Dames, and and in Flanders and Cambrai, they don't want to go through another year like that again, and they make that fateful decision for 1918.
Yeah. To talk about the Ypres salient, I'll have to find it and I'll try to remember to post it up on social media. But I think one of the famous photos is of I believe the New Zealanders, the machine gun crew in the Ypres salient, where like they're basically just in a sea of water.
I know the picture you're talking about.
And
they're Canadian.
He's looking back.
Yes.
They're Canadians? Okay.
And actually, that photo is very interesting because that's the sector, and that is the period just before the 8th Corps takes over from the Canadians. And of course, the 8th Corps, their 8th Division, launches the attack on the right of that 2nd December attack. Yes, that's a very famous photo, and those are the conditions that prevailed. There were American doctors that were attached to British battalions, and in a neighboring division, it was the 49th West Riding Division. They were next to the 8th. At least in that early period, they had a doctor attached to them who couldn't believe that men could live in conditions like that. And we're going a little ahead of ourselves in a sense that I talked about the operation, but if we're talking about setting the stage for the 2nd December attack, what we're talking about is that there are 3 offensives that are launched. What happens is with those aberrational rain and what could be argued a somewhat flawed command style of the British Fifth Army under General Hubert Gough, Haig turns over the main part of the offensive to Herbert Plumer, Daddy Plumer, but the commander of the British Second Army. And he knew the salient like the back of his hand. Okay. And he plans a series of offensives, his army, with the Fifth Army much reduced now, but attacking on his left.
Mm-hmm.
But a series of operations between the 20th of September and the 4th of October, where the Germans are hammered, seriously hammered. And the weather had cleared up by then. In the attack on 20th September, I'm not saying that things weren't still damp from the rainfall, but dust was seen
Wow.
in
Okay.
the Australian sector coming, from, so it's not this, okay. And what was going on is that the British were launching what they would call bite and hold attacks.
Yep.
And early on with Gough, they were advancing to gain as much ground as possible. They were trying to do on the opening day of the battle. And they did achieve a lot of their objectives. However, the Germans, before evening, launched these counterattacks. They massed behind the Passchendaele Ridge. And that was their tactic, is that the Germans had a series of zones that they defended. One of them, the front one, was a sacrifice. So they knew they were going to lose that. But they would draw the British in to these series of zones. You had, defensive positions, pillboxes, mutually supporting each other, crossfire and whatever else. But they would break up the British attackers. And then they would have what they call Eingriff divisions.
Wow.
That were in the rear.
Yep.
And they would launch counterattacks if needed. If the British attacks were halted, well, then the Eingriff divisions weren't deployed. But they had these counterattack divisions. And by that time, the British attacks, they'd sustain casualties. They'd be somewhat disorganized. They'd be weaker. Okay. Right. And so on the 31st of July, some of the divisions, some of the battalions of the attacking divisions, especially in the center, some of the units that went farther forward, companies and platoons, they vanished without a trace in the German counterattacks. There's an account in the British official history, which is published in 1948, of masses of German divisions. They see them coming over the Passchendaele Ridge. Okay, and this is like during the rainfall, but and some of the advanced units were never heard from again.
Wow.
So what Plumer does is differently is that it's recognized during these attacks in August and into early September, but it's recognized that one of the problems is that the British, in their efforts to gain as much ground as possible so they can achieve their strategic designs, is that they're advancing from the protection of their guns.
Right.
Okay.
Fatal
okay.
flaw. Yep.
And it makes the infantry that's advanced ahead, any other unit, makes them vulnerable to German counterattacks. So what Plumer introduces with his Second Army and his chief of staff, Major General Harrington, is that a limited advance, only as far as the guns can take you. Consolidation, and then when the German counterattack divisions come in, you break them up with the defensive artillery fire. And so when I said to you that the Germans were on the ropes, okay, it's these three attacks, in particular one on the 4th of October, where the Germans are desperate. And what saves them? Well, Crown Prince Ruprecht, who commanded, Bavarian Crown Prince, who commanded the group of German armies primarily opposite the British, okay, in his diary, he writes, it was on the 4th of October attack. He said, the weather has broken our greatest ally. And of course, what happens then is that Haig decides that they have to continue the battle despite the weather. And the reason is that they want to get onto the ridge so they can winter on the ridge and continue the offensive in the spring. They've already given up the grand strategic design. That was given up in October. Yeah, it was given up. The amphibious landing, they knew they weren't going to get there, but for 1918. We know now that was never going to happen. Okay.
Right.
But at the time, this was the thinking. Okay. Yep. They want to get up onto the ridge so that they continue these attacks, and they're disasters. There's the Battle of Polkapal, and yep. and then there's the first Battle of Passchendaele, and then they bring in the Canadian Corps. And as I mentioned earlier about the campaign it's a campaign of diminishing returns. And so right. what essentially is happening is, the British are advancing on a narrow front, and they have to, because they're focusing on the ridge. In some places, like opposite Polkapal, you can't even get to the ridge because it's a literal swamp. It's impossible to advance there. They find this out in these October attacks. And so there's no more attacks being launched. You're launching on the ground where there's a good footing.
Wow.
So by the close of the campaign, okay, the British and the Canadians have advanced into a salient around the battle, around Passchendaele Ridge. And then the attack is shut down on the 20th of November. That's the opening day of the Battle of Cambrai. And the Battle of Cambrai is, where tanks were first used en masse, and
right.
the predicted artillery barrage, and they break the Hindenburg line. Okay, but still, Haig still has his eye on Flanders. And so what's happened is that these Anglo-Canadian attacks in October and November have driven this salient around the village. And the Canadian Corps is relieved. They were promised that once they gained Passchendaele and its environs, that they would be gone. And so a British Corps takes over on the right, the 8th Corps. The 2nd British Corps is holding on the left. And what do they find out is that they have no good observation points in the apex of the salient. So where they can dominate, where they can see into the German lines. And so where that is, you're looking to the northeast of Passchendaele village.
Okay.
And you can't see into those, you can't see towards Roeselare. You can't see that low ground that the Germans are now holding, because they're holding very edge defenses there. And then to the northwest, there is an outcrop of land, like a ridge, a small ridge that comes out of the main Passchendaele Ridge, called the Vat Cottages Ridge, and that dominates the low ground facing Plakabal to the northwest. It's difficult to visualize, but and then most importantly, there is this hill that isn't really much of a hill until you stand on it and you look back west. It was called Hill 52, and Hill 52 dominated everything in that area, and the Germans still held that. And what's unusual is, and it was one of the things that I discovered in my book, if you read the British official history of the campaign, and if you read the Canadian official history of the campaign, and any number of books published, in the interwar period, if they even talk about this particular topic in this phase of the battle of this campaign, they say that Hill 52 was captured by the Canadians on the 10th of November. That was the date of the last official attack. Okay. The 1st Canadian Division attacking on the right, and then the boundary, the British second Corps, the 1st British Division attacking on the left. 1st British Division fails to capture the Vat Cottages Ridge, but the Canadians captured Hill 52. Only I couldn't figure out, when I began research for this particular operation, why it was in German hands then. Why was it an objective on the 2nd of December? Oh, right. Maybe the Germans captured it in a riposte sometime between the 10th of November and the 2nd of December, but that wasn't the case also. And I got lucky. I was looking at an intelligence file at the British National Archives, and it told me everything I need to know in one paragraph. And the gist of it was that the Canadians had captured the southern slope of Hill 52. But what they needed to have was the summit, okay,
right,
and the northern slope, and they didn't have it in their hand. So when the British 8th Corps took over the line from the Canadians, their chief of staff, his name was Cecil Faber Aspinall. He wrote the official histories of Gallipoli because he was on Ian Hamilton's staff. Well, he was now a lieutenant general. He was now a brigadier general, and he was the chief of staff of the corps commander, and he surveyed the area, and he said, we have no good observation posts here, and we have two choices. We're in a salient, the Germans are on three sides of us, but they can also fire from the rear, from the Holtus Forest area, which if you're familiar with maps of the Ypres salient, Holtus Forest is, they only ever got to the fringe of it during the 1917 offensive, but the Germans are still there, and they can fire into the rear of the path of this Passchendaele Salient. Okay.
And just to clarify, the Holtuld Forest, that's to the north of Passchendaele.
It's to the north. That's
okay,
to the north of
behind.
Yes.
Yep, and the lines were just barely getting in. Yep.
And so Aspinall says, well, we can try and improve our position in the salient, but the wastage is going to be high. We can't mass a lot of guns there because it's so narrow.
Yep.
Okay. And even to attack, like for instance, to attack to the north, to capture the Vat Cottages Ridge, guns can't fire. There weren't enough guns to fire the kind of creeping barrage that they would use. Okay, because the infantry would have to attack from the position from south to north, but the guns would have to fire from west to east. And British gunners at this time were not able to do that. By 1918, they could do something like that. So they had to rely. I'm going a little ahead of myself, but it shows you the problems that they encountered.
Right.
They had to fire a concentration barrage. Okay, so what does Aspinall? What are his conclusions in this report that he wrote in November 1917? It's, well, we can attack, but there are these problems, okay, that we're going to encounter, like the narrow front, the problem with the guns, or we can fall back to a defensible line. And his recommendation to doing that is to giving up almost all the ground that was taken since the offensive opened on the 31st of July, which this was not going to happen.
Right.
By this time, British GHQ, Haig, and his staff, they were under the gun from David Lloyd George. And to have abandoned all that ground with all that expenditure of lives and treasure, it was just not going to happen. And so the decision was made that they would launch a series of attacks to try and regain, to start anyway, these observation points that they needed. Well, in the 8th Division sector, there was a German defensive position called Venison Trench. It's a linear trench with 2 strong points at the end of it: the southern redoubt and the northern redoubt.
Which you noted wasn't really in keeping with German doctrine at that point, but like,
not at that time. And before we go to the other objective, I'll mention that. Yeah, at this time, the battlefield. I'm sure many of your listeners have seen the photos, the aerial photos, where there's just shell hole. It looks like the surface of the moon.
yeah,
The millions of shells, bombardments, and many of them are filled with water because just being a little bit above sea level. But it looks like the surface of the moon, and it's very good for the Germans, in a sense as defenders, to have the ground in this way, because they have linear defenses, but they can't be observed from the air or from the ground for that matter, because they're able to situate them in these hundreds and thousands of shell holes. And what the Germans called it was the Nier de Gefechtsfelde, if I'm pronouncing that right, the hidden battlefield. Yep. And so it was odd that they would hold this redoubt, these 2 redoubts, and this linear trench in between. You could discern these from the air. There's some aerial photographs reproduced in the book. And why would they do that? Well, once again, it was going to actually studying the ground and going there. I was in a car, and I was driving down the Domkorstraat, which runs between the southern edge of where Venison Trench was, okay, and the site of where the southern redoubt was. And I just went over a little bit of a rise, and I looked east, and I could see the whole hinterland below. The ground slopes down, and it's why the Germans chose to hold on to these positions, even though they were visible, primarily from the air and the gunners and things like that.
Right.
Because to give them up would expose these villages, these building villages, and the outskirts of Roussillon, and make them very close to defend their position. And the same applies to the objective on the left for the Second Corps, Hill 52. Hill 52 dominated the area. The attacking division, if they want to capture Hill 52, would have to attack. Couldn't attack in the daytime. The Germans could see everything.
Right.
And then extending from Hill 52 is the Vat Cottages Ridge. And if you stand, for instance, on the western tip of the Vat Cottages Ridge, as I said, you can see all of this low ground in front of West Trozeby, which is a virtual swamp. It's impassable. Okay, there's a photo in the book that shows dead Tommies from the air. You can see them laying about.
Yes.
The shell holes. That was taken in that sector. And there were a number of divisions that attempted that primarily in October 1917. It was just absolutely impossible. But they could see everything that the Germans were doing down below. You stand there now and you can see the farms. A lot of the farms are in the approximate positions where they were before the war. Okay, and it's very easy if you go to see the sites. And there are some photos in the book of the battlefield today, but you get a grasp of what the tactical problem was. And to the Germans, this was vital ground. One of their divisional generals, he said, not step back and, we're not falling back anymore. The British have taken so much of this ridge. We're not, we're going to resist as long as possible and hold this. So they were determined to defend these positions. But, essentially, so in talking about what happened on the 2nd of December, why the attack was launched, it was to improve to gain these observation points for future attacks. However, it was determined just before the attack that they weren't going to do this. They weren't going to launch these series of operations in the winter to take bites out of the remainder of the ridge and eventually dominate what LoCicero, which is the town at the very northern tip of the Passchendaele Ridge. It was going to, the 2nd December operation was relegated to what they would call a local attack. And they were just going to try and improve the position. And then, maybe in the spring, if they were able to continue the Flanders offensive, they would try and improve the positions that they already had. I think Rawlinson, he never explains why, but I think LoCicero was just considered to be too tough of a nut to crack. It was a veritable fortress by that time, and I just don't think they would rather dominate it from higher ground, at least initially with these attacks that never came off, where they were going to try and bite the remainder of the ridge. So 2nd December operation, once finally launched, is really just to improve observation.
Wow.
In the winter.
So essentially, like you were saying, a local operation, but still sizable, because it's going to involve two infantry divisions, or elements of them, anyways.
Which doesn't seem like much, but once again, 30 being a battle of ever diminishing returns. In the book, I look at the last attacks, and they get, as the fronts narrow, they get the troops involved. There's less troops involved each attack launch. And so by the standards of the latter half of the campaign, even though it's just 2 divisions that are involved, and really with 1 division, it's 1 brigade, and on the left, it's a reinforced brigade. So not the entire division is actually involved, but they're on standby. So you've deployed 2 divisions, and by the standards of this closing period of the campaign, it's a big attack.
Right.
In my opinion.
Right. So Mike, just to back up a bit, like October 1917, specifically the 4th of October. So what happened on that day that so affected the German Fourth Army that was defending against the BEF? And so what happened that so, I would guess, that so hammered the Germans that day? And then how did German adaptations to those attacks go on to affect the 2nd December operation?
Yeah, and there was a direct connection. It's a good question. Well, the 4th of October attack, known as the Battle of Broodseinde, it was one of the 3 Plumer drives, of which, of course, Fifth Army was still involved with. Okay, but you remember that I said that the British infantry would only advance as far as the range of its guns, and then break up the German counterattack divisions. Well, what had happened? The first one was on the 20th of September, the Battle of Menin Road Ridge. And what happened on the 26th of September, the Battle of Polygon Wood, okay? And then Broodseinde, which was a major success for the British. But you have to understand what happened in the first 2 attacks. What happened in the first 2 attacks is that the German counterattack divisions got broken up. They suffered severe capture. They were too far back. So what to do? And it was actually a German OHL decision, Supreme Command decision, that came up with this, okay? And and German Fourth Army carried off. Well, if our reserves, our counterattack divisions, are too far back, then we got to bring them up closer to the front, which they did. And of course, what ended up happening was that as far as to the front line, the outposts, okay, German troops crowded into the zones, okay, or closer to the zones, and that made them vulnerable to British bombardment prior to the attack.
Correct.
And Broodseinde is a great success by the standards of Third Ypres. And it is where the Germans really become concerned, and they're contemplating abandoning their positions on the ridge and falling back into that low ground to get away, to disengage from the British guns, make them redeploy them. And that's problematic because behind you, you have a battlefield that's in state. From all the shelling, you have to rely. And on 4th of October, the weather breaks. Okay. I mentioned earlier about Ruprecht, our greatest ally, the weather broke. So the British are, at least trying to, as I said earlier, to try to capture the ridge before shutting the campaign down. But now time is against them. And so the subsequent attacks, which I mentioned earlier, the Germans learned their lesson from Broodseite. And so what they've done is they've redistributed their forces. They're taking advantage of that delayed to fix the deployment. Okay. But more machine guns, thinning out the defenses. It's the response, and the British have a hard time tackling these defensive systems. However, a colleague of mine has written recently, it's just something to consider. And according to him, the German defense in depth post Broodseite was never really tested because the weather limited what the British were able to do. And so,
okay.
It depends. Another colleague of mine looks at 30, especially at this period, as a logistical engineering effort. That's what he calls it, where engineering is more important. Okay. And that the British didn't have enough Royal Engineer units or labor units, to do what needed to be done to get, supplies to the front, shells, and, reserves, for the Moonlight Massacre attack. The battalions that were not in the line, this is in the winter now, okay? And it's quite cold, but it took them half a day to get to the front line prior to the attack. I mean, the conditions are very bad because you have to rely on, available roads, corduroy roads or duckboard tracks. In the book, I talk about track number 8 that one of the battalions of the 8th Division had to use. In the war diary, they described their progress along there as heartbreaking. And they just barely got to where they needed to be in time.
Wow.
So the conditions are quite bad. At one point, General Rawlinson, who takes over from General Plumer in November 1917, they send Plumer to Italy after the Italian rout at Caporetto. The government insisted upon it. The Lloyd George government insisted upon it. And so Rawlinson is on the coast, commanding, what would be the Flanders coast part of the 1917 Flanders campaign. But that's in abeyance now. So he's sent down south to take over the Second Army. And at one point prior to the attack on the 2nd of December, he writes in his diary, the situation at Passchendaele is terrible, with dead bodies lying everywhere and no way to bury them. So once again, I mean, I might be going ahead of myself, but it is a wonder when you consider the conditions that prevail at that moment, that back in December launched it all. I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, it really is to me because of the difficulties that they encountered. I mean, it just, I write about it in some detail, what the situation was like. And you really have to, the fact that any kind of assault, of an organized assault, was able to be launched it says a lot about, the men, and their commanders.
Yeah. Which as an aside, I want to say from earlier, Plumer is he's pretty much like one of my favorites. I like the him taking care of his soldiers, and then also his bite and hold style. I actually in my house here, I'm known as particularly slow, and especially like trying to get out of the house. So what I tell my family is, and they don't really care to hear it, is like, hey guys, look, like, I'm not Patton, okay? I'm Plumer, all right? Like, I go step by step. I go in my own time, So.
Well, it's a very good analogy. Just as an aside, I when we were talking before before we started the podcast, I
Yeah.
mentioned Rob Thompson.
Mhm.
And interestingly enough, Plumer is certainly one of the best. Rob has some issues with him about the closing stages of Third Ypres and those
Interesting.
attacks at Walkapal and First Passchendaele. And it seems if any of you may have, if any of your listeners, Pryor and Wilson's book, which is one of the best modern histories. It has, some people have some issues with it, but it's a pretty good general history of the campaign, modern history. But it seems that, in an attempt to keep the tempo of offensive operations going from Menin Road Ridge through Polygon Wood through Broodseinde in those attacks that were fiascos, I said, Wakapel and First Passchendaele, that Plumer did not adhere to his normal methodology, careful planning and whatever. And there seems to be a disconnect, and not just at army level in those attacks, also at corps level. So, for instance, one of the villains of the Second Anzac Corps attack on the 12th of October for First Passchendaele is Godley, Sir God, as he was known. Okay, but the corps commander of the Second Anzac Corps. Okay. Just, they could see where they were going to attack on the Bellevue Spur. The New Zealand Division observers could see that the wire hadn't been cut. And of course, the New Zealanders were massacred on that day. They didn't. Most of them didn't get beyond the wire. And so you do see, when I'm talking about, the ability to launch an attack, it is in senses that was what the purpose was, and you're following orders. And this seems necessary and important at the time, but there are flaws.
Right.
Certainly, there are in the 2nd of December attack. The major one has to do with the atmospheric conditions. What's happened on the ground or what's going on up in the sky. We'll touch on that, I'm sure. But anyway.
Yeah. All right. So so the conditions are terrible. You also mentioned in the book when you're talking about particularly using the photographs of some of the folks who some of the men who took part in the operation, that particularly where they were killed, that a fair number of them, you write that their bodies were never recovered in that sea of mud, and that today they're
that's quite common. Even my Belgian friends on their property, which is near on the Messines Ridge, I've been going there for many years, and it's quite common, like in digging around on the property, like he's a landscaper, but in his garden, finding I was there last time, and he had a femur that he found. It's very, very common. You find bits, and and it goes on to this day. Wow. But yes, it's the scars remain. In the area, it's quite common to find artifacts from the war, and of course ordnance. People are still killed and injured, by unexploded ordnance. That's very, very common. Yes.
Right.
The area where the Moonlight Massacre operation took place is an interesting place to visit if you know the ground, because it's not visited very often. It's off the beaten path.
Okay.
It's an area where, I'm not saying no one goes there, but it's not like the Menin Road or Polygon Wood, or Hooga or places like that. It's not that way. And so there's a lot to see if you know the ground.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Oh, good. All right. So you've talked about it a bit already, but if you can, just adding to one of the questions I had here was about developments in both the BEF and the German army by late 1917, which you've already touched on. So, I mean, by this point in the war, like 1917, you bring it up in your book, like a BEF, a Dominion, a Canadian, New Zealand division, German divisions too. Like, these are complex organizations. There's a lot going on. You're talking about the Germans with their concept of the hidden battlefield, and then their defense in depth with the the outpost zone that they sacrifice, and if you can survive and come back to the Hauptwiderstandslinie, the main resistance line.
Yeah, you had like an out for the Germans. You had what the British had to tackle in the 2nd December attack was an outpost line, the Vorfeldzone.
Yes.
Then behind it was the Hauptwiderstandslinie, which was the main line of resistance. And that was as far as the Germans would want to fall back. And what I mean by that is the Vorfeldzone, these line of outposts, were sacrificed essentially.
Wow.
And in the German doctrine at this time, okay, it was very difficult to implement this. I'll touch on that. But what they had, what was is that if the British were launching a big attack, that Vorfeldzone was supposed to fall back to the Hauptwiderstandslinie and join the garrison there. And as the British were traversing the ground in between the outpost zone and the Hauptwiderstandslinie, the main line of resistance, the Germans would fire bombardment, artillery bombardment there, and reduce the number of attackers. And of course, by the time they reached the Hauptwiderstandslinie, they would be diminished and they would lose all their offensive power, and they'd be driven off.
Wow.
The problem was, and Crown Prince Chief of Staff, General von Kohl, in his post-war memoir, he said the problem was how does that Vorfeldzone garrison know when it's a big attack? What if it's a raid?
Right.
Okay. Should they fall back? And they were never able to solve that. And and I touched a lot on the German defensive. We discussed that earlier, but let's focusing on the British. It's quite interesting how attacks were launched at this time. Okay. The historian Andy Simpson, who wrote a book on British Corps commanders in the First World War, he calls it the formulaic approach to operations. And this is how attacks were launched in the latter half of the 30 campaign. And it's very simple how it's done. Army headquarters would draw very terse orders of what they wanted done. And there would be an objective map showing, what was expected to be seized, the current front line, and what that corps with its component divisions was to seize in any operation. And so this would be passed on to corps. And then corps would work with its component divisions. And this would be in the overall plan, but certainly one of the most important things, because heavy guns, for instance, were usually corps assets. Okay. And they would work together and they would develop the details of a plan. This is how the 2nd December attack was done, certainly. Okay. But it was as simple as that. Army staff would drop the orders, pass it on to corps. Corps would work with its component divisions, and then the attack would be launched. Very simple sort of approach, and it did expedite things in a lot of ways because everyone knew what they had to do, and especially at the corps and division level, they would hash out. And of course, division then would work with its component infantry, bring a brigade command, and support units, artillery, Royal Engineers, but it all would come together, and it worked. Whatever the result was, it did work. It was a fit for purpose approach to operations at this point.
Wow. Yeah. So there's a very, very complex and just like you're saying, the formulaic approach. So 2nd December, without, again, Mike, the purpose of this podcast is to get folks, we want you to go out and buy this book. Like you will not be disappointed. But overall, how did this attack unfold? And how did it play out just overall in a broad sense?
Okay, I will make this as concise as possible. It's quite complicated. And I think the most important thing to look at is the actual planning of the attack. How did that pan out? I talked about the formulaic approach. So how did it work out? Well, one of the problems, and it puzzles me about this, is that you're attacking from this very narrow salient, okay? And this salient is divided between two corps. Why not, before the operation, turn it over to one corps commander? And what you have is, and this is, generally speaking, this is against field service regulations at the time.
Is
Okay.
it?
Yeah, you don't, this is not something you really should, it doesn't say it precisely, but it can be interpreted that way. Okay. It's quite odd that this was done. I don't know why Rawlinson didn't turn over the corps to one of the corps commanders involved. He did it after the attack. He turned it over to Hunter Weston of 8th Corps. Hunter Weston takes over. Okay. But for this attack, you have two different corps planning, these attacks that really, even though one is going to the northeast and the other one is attacking to the northwest, it's the same attack.
Mhm.
The divisions share a boundary.
Right.
So what the problem is that the 8th Division of 8th Corps on the right, in their attack on the Venison Trench defenses and those two redoubts,
Yep.
they were advancing in a way to where they could do a creeping barrage, where their artillery could support them. And the objectives are quite limited. Just to remind the listeners, it's just these two redoubts and this trench in between, just a little past that, and that's as far as they're going. It is not a great. It's if I recall correctly, I can't. I think that they're advancing about 300 yards.
You're correct.
Okay. Yeah, it's 300 yards if I recall correctly. I just can't remember all of it. But they're advancing about 300 yards. That's how far their objective is. But they can have but the problem is on the left. The 32nd Division under Major General Cameron Dean Shute, who was a bit of a enfant terrible. Okay.
He lives forever. That poem that Lynn McDonald put in her book.
Yeah, it was when he was commanding the Royal Naval Division.
Yeah.
It was not Aubrey Herbert. Oh, Alan Herbert. Alan Herbert was in the Royal Naval Division, and Shute had an issue with the Royal Naval Division as their with their nautical traditions that remained, even though they were an army division. The Admiralty had turned them over to the army, but he had an issue with them, and it's it's quite famous. What you might not know, though, is just as an aside, Shute became, after the war, he died in 1936. He became the chairman of the Royal Naval Division Association.
Did he really?
And despite the fact that he was so unpopular when he been, but he was very highly thought of, and he was quite ruthless. Okay, in a number of ways, which I don't have time to relate here. But
sure, yeah,
I recount that in the book. You may recall. I know you read it. That situation at the battle in that battle on the Ankh in early 1917, where they were going to place a battalion in a place that they knew it was vulnerable to German gunners, and yet he insisted that that's where it would go. But he was quite ruthless. And the problem that he had is, and I mentioned this earlier, is that his attack on the Vat Cottages Ridge and Hill 52 can be seen forming up in the daylight. Okay, Shute was also aware of the German plan, the German plan that when the British attack, that advanced zone would fall back onto the main line of resistance, and the barrage would come down and cause severe casualties to the attacking infantry. So how to avoid that? First of all, how did he know that? Well, a number of documents had been captured in that period prior to the December 7th attack, the second attack, and Shute was certainly aware of this. I do go into things that he would have learned in reading operational reports from other divisions that were involved in that in the campaign prior to the attack on 2nd of December. So, for instance, there's a lot of documents from the Royal Naval Division where they talked about how they were tackling German pillboxes, for instance. And so, what Shute came to the conclusion is that there would have to be a night attack. Okay, and because his division could not be supported by a creeping barrage, remember I mentioned the infantry attacking from south to north, and artillery firing from west to east. And how do we traverse no man's land and also overrun that Warfelt zone, Meany, and advance to the main line of resistance without the German guns coming down and decimating our men?
Right.
So the plan he came up with is that for the first 8 minutes of the attack, there would be no artillery barrage, and the infantry would go in with the bayonet, and they would achieve surprise. And given the circumstances, it's a very good plan, but there were concerns. So General Henniker, Major General Henniker, who commanded the 8th Division, he had concerns. And he said, I'm more concerned about what unengaged German machine guns would be able to do in those minutes than I am about any German counter barrage. And if they do open up within the period of that 8 minutes, what do we do? Can we have like a contingency plan? And he came up with a number of them. One was that, one of his battalion commanders would fire a flare into the air. Okay. Another one was that they have Lewis guns set up, but Schutt was against this. He said that it would confuse things. Okay. And Schutt was a big proponent of night attacks, and there's nothing wrong with night attacks. But when you launch a night attack, it's not in pitch blackness. There has to be some relative light. And so Schutt wanted this to go in when there was a full moon. And on the night of 2nd December, when they finally went in, it was a waning gibbous moon. So it was just a little past full, but not much. But Henniker was very concerned that he didn't get on with Schutt. I'm not really certain why, but I think it was for a very brief time. Henniker, before he took over the 8th Division, commanded a brigade of the Royal Naval Division at the same time that Schutt was in temporary command of the Royal Naval Division. I think that, but they didn't get on. Okay. And anyway, so Henniker made his concerns known to his corps commander, Hunter Weston, and certainly Jacob, who was Schutt's Lieutenant General Claude Jacob was Schutt's corps commander, and they overruled Henniker's concerns. And, and they stuck with Schutt's plan. And it's actually not a bad plan. But now, if we go into what happens with the actual attack, and this is crucial, this is the crucial thing, is that there was a concern after the attack was over and it had failed, that the Germans knew that they were coming, that they had wind of this operation, that it was going to be launched, and and they prepared accordingly. Only, I did research in German archives, and I found interrogation reports of British prisoners that were captured in the period from both divisions, the 8th Division and the 32nd Division, in the days leading up to the attack on the 2nd December. And what they told the Germans, there was nothing that they could discern from anything that they were told that an attack was coming. However, there was a false alarm, I believe, on the night of the 28th of November, but nothing happened. Now, one of the problems is, of course, the Germans are going to be very alert because the British are attacking on that traversable high ground. So in other words, west of West-Rosebika, you're not going to be able to advance in that swampy ground towards the but they know on the high ground of the ridge that you will have relatively good footing. So they're going to be extra alert there because the only place that the British can attack.
There you go. Yep.
So what happened is that just prior to the attack, there was a light snow. I think enough to blanket the ground. And there were concerns prior to the attack that the snow, in a combination with moonlight, would make the attackers vulnerable. In other words, that they would be spotted before they could.
Yep.
And that, in the forming up, so along the jumping off tape that was laid by the attacking battalions, that they were not detected, and I know this from the German sources. They did not expect it. In one of the regimental histories I used, they have a first-person account where a German officer on the Vat Cottages Ridge sees the British forming up, and he thinks it's a relief. So they form up essentially without alerting the Germans. Even strangers, prior to the attack, patrols were sent out to keep German patrols from discovering the forming up, and they captured one of them. And what was I'll never know the full details, but in one of the German regimental histories, it says that they captured this British patrol, and that important disclosures were made. But those important disclosures aren't related. It just says that. But I think I could surmise what happened is in the German regiment in question that captured these men. It seems that these Tommies must have told them that maybe a raid was coming over.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that, but this regiment prepared for some kind of British attack, but they didn't alert their neighbors.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And I don't know why that was. It doesn't appear to have alerted the neighboring regiments that, something was afoot. And so when the British, they go in, the attack opens at 1:55 a.m. in the morning, no artillery barrage, and the British advance, and they essentially in opposite the Venison Trench and the redoubts, they overrun and surprise the Warfelt Zone. It was a Hessian division. It was the 25th Hessian Division. They overrun their outposts.
Yep.
And they advance. Whereas on the left, with the 32nd Division, there was one small thing that happened that's important is there was this obscure German pillbox that the Germans abandoned and the British occupied in, I think it was on the 22nd of November. And when the 32nd Division took over, there was a boundary adjustment there with the 8th Division.
Yep.
The battalion holding that sector where this pillbox was, it was along the Passchendaele West Rosadika Road. It was a little tiny pillbox, and it was on the British maps as Teal Cottage.
Yes.
And the Germans had abandoned it, and so a battalion didn't take part in the 2nd December assault because it had been relieved by this time. It was from another brigade, the 32nd Division. They had an outpost in there, and of I don't know, 10 men from the 2nd Guerrilla Inniskilling Fusiliers. And the Germans decided what was happening prior to the 2nd December attack is both divisions were trying to narrow the distance of no man's land. And so they were sending out offensive patrols at night and driving back German outposts and occupying ground to get as close as the German outpost zone as possible, meaning especially on the right, the Warfelt zone there, okay? But they were pushing back they were trying to push the Germans back and make the distance to their objective narrower. And so the Germans launched, they were getting concerned about this, so they brought up another regiment from another division to launch a local counterattack, and it was defeated. But interestingly enough, this would be just on the eve of before they could do anything on the night of the 1st and 2nd December, on the 30th of November. So you only have the night of the 30th and the 1st of December to correct anything that could possibly go wrong, because you can't show yourself in daytime. Right. Everything has to be done at night. So anyway, the Germans launched this riposte, and it's beaten off. But what they didn't know is, and I will, maybe this is a little more detail than one, but it's an interesting story. Nightfall came. Nightfall of the 30th and the 1st of December. British command on divisional level, corps level, they've written off this attack. It's beaten off, no issues. So there was a company commander, the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers. His name was Kundal, Captain Kundal, MC. And darkness fell on the night of the 30th, 1st of December, 30th November, 1st December. He got out of his shell hole position and began to, check on his men. Couldn't be seen easily, and wandering around darkness. And he made his way towards Teal Cottage. Now, Teal Cottage is right at the junction of the two divisions. Okay, this is why it's important.
Another issue.
Approaches the cottage, and in the word diary, they heard a shout, which was probably like, "Wer da? Who's there?" And then a machine gun opened up, and poor Kundal was killed. And that's how they found out that this machine gun position, this pillbox, had two German machine guns in it, and it was right on the boundary of two attacking divisions. And they launched some counterattacks, but they got nowhere. And so one memoir connected with the 2nd December assault, the officer who wrote it was a posthumous memoir. He said it put the fox amongst the hens. Essentially, that's how he described it.
Yep.
And of course, when the attack goes in, Teal Cottage has not been subdued. And what seems to have happened is that you had that combination of bright moonlight and snow. And once I mentioned that German officer who saw them milling about and thought there was a relief in progress, once they start moving and they're coming closer towards the German positions, apparently on the back Cottage's ridge, some flares went up. There was a rifle shot, and then the machine guns in Teal Cottage and along the ridge, and then over towards Passchendaele, where the 8th Division was attacking. they all opened up simultaneously.
Mm.
And especially where 32nd Division was attacking, the machine guns achieved tactical dominance and inflicted heavy losses on officers and NCOs. And so where the 8th Division attacked, it's very simple. Of course, I described this in detail, but the battalion on the right, they put out a flank guard that's successful, and they capture Southern Redoubt, but they aren't able to retain it. The 2nd Lincoln's in the center. This is the 25th Brigade of the 8th Division. They stop and dig in front of Venison Trench, except for one small outpost under an officer that occupies the southern end of it. And on opposite the northern redoubt, the 2nd Rifle Brigade, they only get as far as these practice trenches. You see, the Venison Trench defenses originally were practice trenches when the German front line was farther west.
Yep.
And when new recruits would come from Germany, it was felt at this time that they weren't trained well enough. So they would practice the trench warfare.
Sure.
There, tossing bombs and clearing a trench and what else. And so the Germans never thought that they would be, they'd be fighting there again. There was even a large cemetery that disappeared. I don't mention it in the book, but it was along the road to Osnabrück. It's vanished. But they have, they buried their dead there from, earlier battles, First Ypres and Second Ypres and whatever else. So, the 8th Division attack breaks down. 32nd Division is much more complicated, but in a nutshell, despite the German machine guns inflicting heavy casualties on the leaders, the 2nd Koenigsberg Yorkshire Light Infantry on the right, they seize Hill 52, but they're not able to hold it. Okay, and eventually, in a German counterattack in the afternoon, they're driven off the hill and back down to the front line, their original front line. The remaining battalions, there's one in particular, the 11th Border Regiment. They take almost all of their objectives, but the other ones, in some case, it's the 16th Highland Light Infantry, the 11th Border Regiment, the 17th Highland Light Infantry, and the 15th Lancashire Fusiliers. And then there's a battalion behind. It's interesting that they did this. It goes as far as the Schutz's command style, which is a counterattack battalion, because they're preparing. If they seize their objectives and the Germans launch that immediate counterattack, they have a whole battalion in place that they can push the Germans back.
Yep.
And it's a mixed bag. The 11th Borders advance the farthest. The 15th Lancashire Fusiliers on the far left take most of their objectives, but they don't really have that much to take because they're trying to capture that western end of the Back Cottages Ridge.
Yep.
17th Highland Light Infantry get almost nowhere. And the 16th Highland Light Infantry seize half of their objectives. But by the afternoon, the Germans begin to launch these counterattacks. And you can try and imagine two boxers that have battered each other.
Yep.
From the commander of the counterattack counterbat battalion, in his report, he thinks the German attack is very lackluster. But with all those leaders down, and Hill 52 already lost in an earlier counterattack, it's almost like the Germans just advanced and the Tommies that remain just sort of, I'm not going to say leisurely, but they just kind of creep back into their frontline positions again. Yep. Yep. And shoot, of course, it's interesting. I can find no evidence that General Henniker or the brigadier in question of the brigade, it was General Clifford Coffin. He was the first British general officer during the BC in the Great War. Earlier in the Third Ypres campaign, for that, it was during the Battle of the Battle of the opening. It's not San Juan. It's Longamark is one, and the one. Okay. Anyway, I digress. But in any case, I can find no evidence that they wanted to continue this attack. Henniker was against it. In his diary, he called it a beastly operation.
Yes.
Classic British understatement. Okay, but shoot, had a reputation to maintain. And there's no question about this in my mind. He told his predecessor from the 1st Division he failed, we're going to do this. He told Rawlinson, we're going to do this. And so when the attack broke down, he's back at the canal bank near Ypres, and he's trying to get the attack going again. And one of the things in my book that I think the readers would find interesting is is I found the original telephone and telegraph transcripts,
Yes.
where it's fly on the wall stuff. And what's interesting was the ones for 8th Corps survived, but not the ones for 8th Division. But the ones for 32nd Division survived, but not the ones for 2nd Corps. And with this 32nd Division transcripts, Schutt is yelling at his brigadier over the phone when he finds out that the success they thought that they achieved. Because initially, they thought Hill 52 was in British hands and whatever else. But the communications, they were excellent up to brigade headquarters. But from brigade to battalion, not so much. And the problem is that the communications broke down quickly. And the runners that were sent back, I mean, they littered the duckboard tracks. You mentioned, we were talking earlier about the 32nd Division, that book about the 32nd Division gunners and mortarmen. And one of the accounts in there, they talk about when they go up to the line and seeing all the dead runners, German snipers picked off as they went there. So Schutt tries to get the attack going again, even to the point of where he is going to, he comes as close to the line as he can. It's actually near Gravenstock, a little to the west of Gravenstock. And he meets with his commanders, and he's even getting ready to send another brigade in to launch this attack. And so for him, he was serious about doing this. The fact that he used a reinforced brigade tells you that he was leaving nothing to chance. He was going to throw all those men at that objective, and he was going to take it no matter what. And so essentially what happens is certainly by the afternoon of the 2nd of December, the attack has broken down. And by the evening, Schutt is waiting to get permission to continue the attack. But as far as the 8th Division goes, General Henniker, Brigadier General Coffin, it seems that once it broke down that they were done with it.
Yeah. So the 2nd December, the attack pretty much stalls out, by the 3rd, and definitely by the 4th of December. So what could both the British and Germans learn from the actions on the night of the 2nd to the 3rd? And did any of the lessons learned in this night operation, did they have a role in any later battles in 1918?
Yes. Just before I answer that, what happened that the attack was discontinued is important, because what happens is that Schutt requests from Army headquarters to continue the attack.
Okay.
And it goes up the chain of command, and the next person it goes to is Haig's Director of Operations, General Davidson. And General Davidson, by the time he responded to big events that occurred, essentially, one of the most important is, and it's not ignored by the British government or certainly GHQ, but in the East, the Bolsheviks begin negotiations with Imperial Germany at Brest-Litovsk.
Right.
And of course, you can see the writing on the wall that, Russia could lead the war, and, the Germans would be at a real advantage in 1918. There were also in London, in Whitehall, there was an important meeting where the Secretary of State for War, Lord Derby, basically said to the Prime Minister and the ministers, we need more men for the 1918 campaign. And they were basically told, nope, whatever you have. It's always been said that Lloyd George starved the army of men. It's not really true. The British Army and the War Office could have sent troops doing garrison duty in Britain, which they eventually did. Okay, but that's not what the War Office was saying. They wanted to comb out men from, for instance, from vital industry, shipbuilding, coal, whatever else. That was the problem. But they weren't going to give Haig any more new soldiers. You have soldiers in the UK, use those. That's what they were saying to him. So when Davidson responds to Rawlinson, it's very interesting because it shows you like the dynamics, how something that's necessary and important 24 hours before, 48 hours before, is now no longer the case. But essentially what Rawlinson is told is that we can't justify any more loss of men in an operation like this. And essentially we're going to be going on the defensive, and just in a matter of days, Haig has a meeting with his army commanders and tells them as much. We need to go on the defensive. The Germans are going to be bringing troops from the east, and we need to prepare for that. And so that put paid to the operation from anything that Schutt wanted to do. And that was the end of it. And the irony of it is, you asked about what they learned. Well, one thing, let's talk about the British first. With the British, they're holding Passchendaele Salient. And of course, that was one of the concerns. We have no good observation posts. Well, they hold it until the Battle of Ypres opens further south in early April 1918. And and that's when they abandoned it. They abandoned it to the Germans. So what they decided to do was they would hold the forward area where the attack was launched from with a series of outposts. But at the core, at the base of the salient itself, that would be a defensive position that they would fall back to, and then they would abandon. But if the Germans did attack it from three sides, they let it collapse like a bag.
Yep.
And they did the same with the Flanders salient, which was a consequence of the Battle of Cambrai. Okay, they held it in that same way prior to Kaiserslautern. Okay, and the other lessons that, well, there were a number of things that we can't go into detail here, but there were questions about deployment and equipment. Those are produced in an appendix at the end of the book, where the battalion commanders and whoever else, they produced appreciations about the attack and their experience, the equipment and the conditions of duckboard tracks and support and whatever else. But you mentioned about in 1918, it's a very minor thing, and it's on my to-do list. It's one of the next things I'm going to write. I contribute to a series of books that's published by the same publisher that published A Moonlight Massacre, and they're compendium volumes edited by my colleague Spencer Jones, who's a lecturer here in Britain, and his main area of expertise is the Old Contemptibles in 1914. But he's a brilliant scholar. He's done a series of books, and they're on the British Army from 1914, and the one on 1917 will be out shortly. But the last volume for 1918, the chapter I'm going to do for that, concerns this gigantic raid that was launched against the German positions on the Holtus Forest by the 32nd Division in February 1918. It was probably one of the largest British raids ever on the Western Front, and most people have never heard of it. But the division in question was the 32nd Division, commanded by none other than Major General Cameron Schutt. And so you said, well, what did they learn? Well, this is quite interesting. In the operational orders, and I've only just done a little bit of research on this, so I haven't really started it seriously. But one of the things it says in the operational orders is that they're going to attack at night under a full moon. But if there's snow on the ground, the operation's going to be postponed.
All right.
And the raid was, by the standards of the time, was a success. Now, unlike the attack on 2nd December, I have seen some histories, newer histories. There was one on the 11th Border Regiment, for instance, that referred to it as a raid, and the author didn't know. He was looking at the broader subject, but it wasn't a raid. It was an attack to gain territory. Right. Whereas this was just a gigantic raid where they went, they struck the German positions in front of the Holtus Forest, and entered a little bit into the to the edge of the wood, and then they came back. I'm looking forward to writing this, because I will be able to return to this particular project that took me 11 years again. I'm going to have to refer to it. So I'll see it as kind of like an expanded footnote to my expanded footnote to 30, which is what A Moonlight Massacre really is in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. Awesome. All right.
And as far as the Germans go, really, one of the things about this attack is, what really was amazing to me is, in looking at German intelligence reports and these interrogation reports, or what Crown Prince Ruprecht wrote in his actual diary, not the one that was published, is that how much they knew about what the British had tried to do in less than 8 hours. a number of the prisoners gave the game away. Okay, I mean, Ruprecht knew it was 2 brigades. He knew it was a limited objective. He knew there wasn't going to be an artillery barrage, but it did confirm to the Germans that, that the campaign was certainly nearing its end. They officially declared it over on the 5th of December. And in their official history, okay, to them, this was the last attack of the campaign. Whereas in the British official history from 1948, it's entirely ignored.
Right.
And which is curious. It did also confirm to them, that their approach to the defense, was the correct one, at least, in repelling this attack. And the casualties amounted to 1,689 men killed, wounded, and missing, which is, think about, I mean, I know it's relative and all, but think about if in any of the recent wars that we have today, if you lost that many men in a day.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is an operation that's just, by Great War standards, most people have never heard of it. So.
It's also interesting, Mike, to compare it to, like, gosh, I think it's the Battle of Mons in 1914, where I think there was about 1,600 British casualties for that day, and that was considered still considered a pretty epic fight. And then 3 years later, a 2-division raid, get 1,600 casualties, and I shrug, but I don't shrug like, as in it doesn't matter. I just, like, that's kind of the attitude, like, oh, it's just what happens nowadays. Like,
you make a good point, because one of the reasons that the battle was forgot has to do with the Battle Nomenclatures Committee. Battle Nomenclatures Committee decided for Great Britain and and the Dominions, they would name the campaigns and the battles and the actions of the Great War. And there was I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with a book called British Regiments, 1914-18. It was compiled by Brigadier General E.A. James. And it's a gazetteer of where they all were during the Great War. Well, he did an earlier book when I believe he was a captain. And it's a book about what the British Battle Nomenclatures Committee came up with. And one of the points he makes it's just a tiny little book. You can actually find it online. There's a free ebook. You can find this. Okay. But in the introduction, it's just this little tiny booklet, and he says that the reader will notice that these earlier battles, like in 1914, don't involve the number of formations or units or men that latter battles do, but they seem to receive a kind of this prominence that if they were fought later, they would not get.
Right.
And then he goes on to say, and I found this while I was preparing the book, so it wasn't when I was doing my thesis, but I was glad that I just by a fluke. Then he goes on to say, he said, for example, and he mentions one of the during the retreat from Mons, he mentions one of the engagements there. He says, conversely, he said, an attack by the 8th and the 32nd Divisions near Passchendaele on the 2nd of December 1917 will not be found in this volume. And it was because the Battle Nomenclatures Committee overlooked it. And I don't know why they did that. I don't know. Okay. However, the official historian, the only reason I can think of that he overlooked it, the British official historian, the 1948 volume that covers the entire campaign, the only reason I can think he overlooked it is that the Second World War was over. The book was published in 1948.
Yeah.
Brigadier General James Edmonds, who was the head of the historical section of the Committee of Imperial Defense that compiled these volumes from 1917, while the war was still going on. They'd already begun work. Okay. He was in his 80s. Right. And right after VJ Day, in the summer of in 1945, had been the head of the RAF. Anyway, someone stood up in Parliament. My mind just went blank, but somebody stood up in Parliament. He was the former commander of what became the RAF during the Great War, Trenchard. Okay. He stood up, and they wanted a challenge to Lloyd George's perspective on 30, the Battle of the Mud, and he excoriated Haig in his memoirs. And he stood up in Parliament and said, when is this volume of the official history going to come out? So there was a rush to get it out. Yep. And I think Edmund certainly knew about it. There's no question about it. That he did. I'm certain of that. But it was just, I think, the time was up. And there wasn't a lot of interest in the war that had been fought previous to the one that just ended. And you have that wartime austerity, which extends into the late 50s.
Correct.
And, and the government, I think, from what I understand, they basically said to Edmonds, get on with it, get these books finished, and then we're done. And so so I think that's how it ended up being obscured, unless you look at an 8th Division history or you read that obscure battalion history. But it just ended up, even in some of the best chronologies of the war that I've seen, they don't mention it. And they'll tell you about a Broadway show that opened up, in New York City in August 1970. And here you have this really what I think is the end of the Third Ypres campaign.
Right.
And it's entirely neglected.
Right. Mike, thank you so much. What a fascinating discussion. And what listeners don't know is that Mike and I were actually, I think we talked for about an hour before we actually began recording. So this has been.
I get to have many, even here, I work from home. I work for a publisher. I work for the publisher that published the Moonlight Massacre.
Yep.
And I don't get to have these kinds of conversations with people. But Mike, I really enjoyed it. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk about something that was a real labor of love for me. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. And again, folks, the name of the book is A Moonlight Massacre: The Night Operation on the Passchendaele Ridge, 2nd December 1917. A link to the book will be made available in the episode notes. Of course, your local bookstore could probably use the support, so definitely buy it through them. Of course, it's always available through Amazon and other large online retailers. So Mike, thank you so much for taking time out of what is now your afternoon to come on the podcast. Thank you.
Yes, it's going on 3 o'clock.
Wow.
You were up at 8 o'clock, if I recall.
Yeah, well, I was up much earlier, but I'm an early riser anyway. So awesome, fascinating. And one last quick aside for listeners, if you're interested in General Shute, who there's just a line from that poem is I refuse to command a division that leaves its excreta about.
I might remember the line. It says, for shit may be shot at odd corners and something supplied there to suit, but a shit would be shot without mourners if somebody shot that shit shoot. I think that's it. I reproduce it in the book, but I can't remember that one part.
That's it. I believe it's called October Slog, and it's one of the last Psalm episodes. It's talking about October 1916, and I read the entire poem there. So if folks go find that episode, and
if you give me just 2 more minutes, I will tell something.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You might find interesting yourself. Shute was a victim of an attempted blackmail plot.
Was he
in
really?
the mid-1920s. It's a very odd story. In a nutshell, when he was in command of Northern Command, like in the northern part of England after the war, he was one of the men slated for promotion after the war, along with Henniker, too, I might add. Okay, and there were these 2 Tommies who apparently got in trouble and were court-martialed. I don't remember. And so they harbored a real animosity towards General Shute. So eventually they left the army and they decided that they were going to try and blackmail the good general. So they sent him a letter claiming to be the London Camorra, like the mafia.
Oh,
okay?
Wow.
Okay. All right. And they basically said, pay us, I don't know, £500, which is a lot of money in the mid-20s. Okay. Yep. Or, your daughter, you have a daughter, she's in danger, we'll kidnap, so if you want to avoid trouble with us, well, they asked for the money. He went to Scotland Yard and he asked for the money to be. And he told them they asked him to write a check and go to this post office box.
Yep.
Where he was told to leave it. Well, of course, it was placed in the post office box, and Scotland Yard was waiting, and they arrested him. Okay, and they pressed charges, and they went to prison for a time and whatever else. But yeah, I don't think he was a much loved individual. And
No.
even in his obituary, they say, well, he was a very outspoken, and and they don't use the word demanding, but he was and Henniker wasn't much different, but Henniker didn't have the ruthlessness from what I've read
Right.
of someone like Schiff. But anyway, an odd story there about Schiff.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's amazing. This is the kind of stuff we live for here. So this is amazing. Mike, thank you again so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. And when your next work comes out, I'm happy to talk to you about that as well. So if you will just stay with me, I'm just going to stop recording. So thank you again.